Hello and assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining me again. In this video, I will be continuing in my discussion on Adam and Eve, the COVID, and the impacts of disobeying and breaking the covenant. There was a point I wanted to pick up from the last video. We saw in the case of Adam and Eve, they ate from the tree, and as a result had to face expulsion because God had already warned them that should they disobey, this is what would happen, should they eat from the tree. I made the point that although Adam and Eve were forgiven by God, it didn't prevent or stop the expulsion. There is this understanding within Islamic traditions that Adam and Eve was made for the earth. And so they were actually destined to come to the earth. This is a prevailing Orthodox view. However, this view is not inconsistent with what all that I've just said. The garden, the tree, the presence of Shaitan were all a test for Adam and Eve. And this is consistent with the covenant in that God says that we created human beings so that we may try them to see which of them are best in conduct. Best in conduct means to see which of them will adhere to the covenant and all that the covenant stipulates. And of course, in the case of Adam and Eve, their compact or covenant with God at that time was that they would obey him and eat not from the tree so that they might be expelled. This was their trial. And God says that he forgot. He forgot. And we didn't find much resoluteness or firmness or determination in him to hold to this covenant. And as a result, breaking the covenant resulted in a wretched state of suffering. So this is the first cause of human suffering. So the first cause of human suffering is our parents, Adam and Eve, breaking their covenant and then being expelled out of the garden. Okay? So this is the first cause of suffering. Now, we're not to blame Adam and Eve for this because Allah has forgiven them, and Allah has even went so far as to choose Adam to be the first prophet. However, Adam and Eve failed in in maintaining their covenant, and they did that only once. The Quran says that we started to teach him certain words, we chose him, and he was able to become the first prophet and vicegerent on earth, on God's earth, right? The first vicegerent and prophet on God's earth. When we break the covenant, much like our parents, Adam and Eve, it results in sin or wretchedness as described in the Quran. Now, this wretchedness is a state of suffering. And this is why it's important to mention this. And we can see in the story of Adam and Eve how their state of wretchedness took the form of them leaving can be said to be the ideal spiritual state, right, into a lesser spiritual state in which they were now there was a distance that was being created. What's interesting about one of the things that the study Quran makes mention is that when Adam and Eve ate from the tree and they were stripped of their raiment or their spiritual condition, their ideal spiritual condition, God said that they started to cover themselves. And so and then God, of course, called out to them, and he said to them, did I not forbid you to eat from this tree, and that this was an enemy of yours? And what it says about this is that it notices that the language of the Quran starts to change. Where before, prior to him and her eating from the tree, the way God addressed them was in a language of the Quran in which connotes an intimacy, a closeness, right? A nearness to God. And when he called out to them after they ate from the tree, the language of the Arabic language started to change, in which it started to denote a distance and alienation. Of course, it represented or symbolized their spiritual devolution from this perfect spiritual state in which they were in which they were very close to God. So the mystical meaning of that entire story ultimately is this, that they had occupied this spiritual ideal state represented and symbolized in the environment of the garden. When they were made to be expelled from it, it also resulted in his personal, individual, spiritual decline, right? Such that the study Quran could acknowledge that there was a distance in the way God was addressing them now. They were no longer near to him in the same way that they were before. Hence, they were cast out, as it were, removed from nearness. And this, of course, is exemplified in the fact that they were now being brought down to earth. Now, humanity now, as a result of the covenant, is now expected, much like Adam and Eve, to not only to maintain their purity, but now to reacquire it, because they had lost it by virtue of now being the descendants of Adam and Eve on earth. And this is really what religion is all about, is to reacquaint us with this quest to return to the garden. The first return, of course, while we are here on earth, is to regain our spiritual purity, the like of which our parents had, and not to be stripped of it. Another cause of human suffering is the nafs, or the soul. Nafs is the Arabic term that refers to the soul, the human soul. The soul is the very thing to which God was alluding to Adam he would run into in chapter 7:19, in which the Quran labeled a wrongdoer. The nafs, or soul, is the primal cause of suffering of human beings. We have an example of this truth in the story of Cain and Abel, when Cain was motivated by jealousy and killed his younger brother. In chapter 5, verse 30, the Quran states, "Then his soul, Cain, prompted him to slay his brother." This soul is referred to as the soul that commands to evil, as in chapter 12, verse 53, we hear the Prophet Yusuf saying, "I absolve not my own soul, surely the soul commands to evil." In chapter 45, verse 23, the Quran states, "Hast thou considered one who takes his caprice, the soul's lusts or passions, as his God? God has led him astray knowingly, and sealed his hearing and his heart and placed a cover upon his sight. So this soul is being acknowledged as something that could evidently mislead someone. In fact, in Orfani Islamic literature, this soul is referred to as Nafs AlAmara. And they say that this soul has three qualities. It's the soul, one of the quality is that it has no control over its passions, desires, lusts. It is always, the person is always led by these base desires. Another element to the soul, of course, that is somewhat redeeming is that even though this person who possesses these traits may sin, that there's some people who feel guilty from their sin. And so although they possess this type of soul, they may change their ways as a result of this guilt. And this guilt, of course, comes from their conscience, right? And then, of course, there's another quality or characteristic of the soul in which the person is, of course, is quick to anger, has no control over their passions, and has no remorse for any evil actions or deeds that they do, none whatsoever. And so these are the three attributes or quality of the soul. And of course, these qualities exist to different intensities within different individuals, depending on how they're brought up, raised, the environment they're in, what they are exposed to, etc., etc. And these qualities can be either accentuated or reduced significantly. And so God says that this is the soul. This is the soul in which one comes with. Now, how does the human soul cause human suffering is really the question that we need to speak to. We already seen how the breaking the covenant results in punishment or suffering. And we see that the only way to really break the covenant is if you're either in a state of disbelief in the religion that God has sent, and if you have not accepted God. So this puts you in a state of exposure to punishment, to suffering, by God associating certain negative or evil energies in the form of the jinn. He exposes them to you. So that's one way. And now, this is another level in which God is saying that at the level of the soul, if a person is not in control of their soul, they are then opened up to being exposed and misled by a soul that has these desires. The evil referred to is both an admission of its presence within the human being, as well as the fact that we are the cause of our own suffering. This fact is borne out by the following verse. God says that corruption has appeared on land and sea because of that which men's hands or souls have earned, that he may let them taste some of that which they have done. So in the study Quran, the word corruption is fasad, and it implies, according to the study Quran, all manner of human decadence and injustice. So you can think of any act that is morally reprehensible or sinful or evil or unjust or oppressive. This term corruption in this verse is referring to that. So God says that, right, that this corruption has appeared on land and sea because of that which men's hands or deeds have done, that he may let them taste of that which they have done, right? So God is saying that this corruption happens at the level of the soul, right? And as a result, that when people earn sin, right, or they allow their souls to lead them through life, it results in sin. And God says that no part of the earth will be spared from this. God says on land and sea. And we can see that this is certainly the case if you look at the world today in which we inhabit, in which our entire planetary system is in near collapse, right? Whether we look at what's happening on land, so many species have been extinct, so many droughts and forest fires. The environment has been so altered by human beings through the form of capitalism and greed, that whether you look at what's happening on land or whether you look at the depletions that's happening within the sea of our natural resources there, or even when you look at the sky, right, we're literally pulling or destroying our sky simply because we cannot stop, right, the machinery of capitalism, right? And so this is the extent of human greed, right? Ultimately what it comes down to, right? And the greed, of course, has taken on a life of its own to such an extent that we can't seem to pull ourselves, or we can't seem to stop immediately, because it would really disrupt our lifestyle. And we would sooner rather not have that. We would sooner die before we have that happen, right? So inshallah, God, may Allah help us to find solutions to our global problems that we seem to be having when it comes to the environmental issues that have become a global threat to all of humanity. But the verse is a very apt verse because it does in very simple terms, explicit terms, refer to what we're seeing here even now in our contemporary times. And God says that this is the result of the human soul, motivated, of course, by greed. So the manifestations of this suffering can appear in, as I've said, in worldly and spiritual misfortunes and deprivations. Take, for instance, the story of the two men who were arguing about God. The one who was self-assured yet arrogant attributed his wealth and status to himself and rejected the belief in God. Ultimately, his covenant with God. And as a result, for this arrogance, the Quran says, so his fruits and enjoyment were encompassed with ruin, and he remained twisting and turning his hands over what he had spent on his property and what he had invested in his property. which had now tumbled to pieces to its very foundations. And he could only say, woe is me, with that I had never ascribed partners to my Lord and cherisher. So this verse really is remarking about his ascribing partners to God, one, and moreover, he was ungrateful in that he didn't recognize that his wealth from the 2 gardens that he had, the plentiful rain that it received, the many sons that he had, and people under his care that he had, was all a blessing from God. And instead, he went out and accused the other man who was less fortunate than him but believed in God. And he said, well, this is really due, my wealth and my status and position in life is really due to me, and not because of some God. And of course, God said that this was an attitude in which he was a rejecter of faith. He ascribed partners to God, in which he was basically saying, God wasn't responsible for all these blessings, I am responsible. And in this way, he was attributing himself. He was putting himself, or trying to substitute God himself for God. And God says he was attributing himself to God. And so God says that this was the first, this is an attitude that breaks the covenant. And in doing so, God says that we caused him we took away this blessing from him. And so what happened was he invested a whole heap of money into his garden. And then God says that God made the weather destroy the garden. And so he wasn't able to yield whatever the garden would then cause him to sell and make back his investment. So God says that we took that away from him. And so what this story then shows is that according to the Qur'anic view, misfortunes and their consequence of suffering manifest into the world from the sins human beings do at the level, or commit at the level of the soul. It's important to note that these misfortunes are attributable to ourselves and not to God. Right? So just like how this man became arrogant and adopted this arrogant position, it resulted in his garden being lost. So misfortune had visited him as a result of that. So this is just to show you the connection between what happens at the level of the soul and how we invite suffering into the actual world that we live in. I want to leave it there for now. I'll continue in the next video. I want to thank you for your time. Assalamu alaikum and goodbye for now.